I still remember the first time I saw her. It was a cold, grey Monday morning, the kind of day where the city feels like it's been drained of colour. People rushed past one another with the same tired urgency, their eyes fixed on phones, watches, or the ground. But then, out of nowhere, there she was, like a little flicker of sunshine where it didn't belong. A girl, small, barely 10 years old, standing right in front of the towering glass building where I work, a giant structure of money and metal. She didn't belong there, but she stood like she did. She had no fancy stall, no umbrella, no protective gear from the wind, just a hand-woven basket filled with flowers that looked like they'd been picked from the edges of forgotten parks. Roses, daisies, even a few crushed marigolds, all tied together in little bunches with pieces of old ribbon. Her clothes were worn but clean. Her hair was tied back in a messy ponytail, and her cheeks were smudged with dust. But what struck you first wasn't any of that. It was the smile, a genuine, warm, almost defiant smile, the kind that didn't beg, the kind that offered hope. "Morning, sir. Would you like to buy a flower today?" she chirped, holding out a slightly wilted daisy toward a man in a suit. He grunted and walked past, but she didn't flinch. She just turned to the next person with the same energy. "Morning, ma'am. One flower for your desk?" I stopped a few feet away, pretending to check my phone while I watched her. One woman in HR, Susan I think, paused, gave a nervous smile and handed the girl $1. The flower she got in return looked like it was on its last leg. Still, Susan tucked it behind her ear and walked inside, smiling. That was the beginning of a routine. For days, then weeks, the girl was there every morning, rain or shine, basket in hand, same smile, same greeting, same unmatched resilience. She told people her name was Lila, and whether she sold 1 flower or 10, she always stayed until the morning rush ended. Her favorite spot, right beside the revolving doors of the building, as if she were waiting for them to open for her. Some of us, quietly, started keeping loose change just for her. Not because we needed the flowers, but because she made mornings feel human again. Like a reminder that even in this corporate jungle, kindness still bloomed. There was something poetic about her, honestly. But not everyone saw it that way. One particular morning, everything changed. Lila was humming softly, some old lullaby, I think, as she arranged her flowers beside the door. A few people had already bought from her. The air smelled faintly of roses, which was a miracle in a city that usually smelled like car exhaust and burnt coffee. Then a sleek, black car pulled up. It was the kind of vehicle you didn't see often, and when you did, you knew someone important had arrived. Out stepped a tall man in a tailored suit, Grayson Cole, CEO, the kind of man who made elevators go silent when he entered. He walked like the sidewalk belonged to him. I watched as his eyes landed on Lila. They narrowed instantly, like she was graffiti on his building. He didn't speak at first, just paused in front of her, looking down like she was some strange stain on the pavement. Lila, ever cheerful, offered him a flower. "Good morning, sir. This one's special. It smells like sunshine." There was a pause, cold, unmoving. Then came the words. "Security," he said into his phone, not even looking at her. "Get this girl off my property, now." Lila blinked. Her hand, still holding the flower, trembled just a little. She lowered it. No one said anything, not even me. We just stood there, frozen, as 2 guards came out of the building. One of them, Marcus, had bought flowers from her the week before. "Come on, sweetie," he said gently. "Let's go." "But I didn't do anything," Lila whispered, her voice barely holding back tears. "I wasn't bothering anyone." "I know," Marcus muttered, avoiding her eyes. "But orders are orders." They escorted her away like she was a criminal. As she walked, one of her flowers fell from the basket. A red rose. It landed at Mr. Cole's feet. He didn't even glance at it. And just like that, the little girl who made mornings feel like spring was gone. The pavement felt colder without her. And none of us knew it yet, but that moment, that cold command from the top, would start a chain of events none of us could have predicted. It's strange how quickly a person's absence can change the energy of a place. The very next morning, without Lila on the sidewalk, the building entrance felt off. The rhythm was broken. People still walked in and out, coffee in hand, heads buried in phones. But something small, something kind, had gone missing. And that something had a name. Lila. No chirpy greetings, no hopeful little daisy bouquets, no burst of colour at the grey curbside, just cold concrete and silence. For the first time in weeks, I saw the receptionist glance out the glass doors, confused. Susan, the HR woman who used to buy flowers and tuck them behind her ear, actually looked disappointed when she stepped outside. I wasn't the only one feeling it. She had become more than a child selling flowers. She was part of our mornings, our emotional wallpaper. But she was gone, and I knew exactly why. I didn't even have to guess what had happened after security walked her off the property the day before. But what I didn't know until later, what made it all worse, was just how it unfolded after she was led away. Marcus, the security guard who escorted her, told me everything, and he looked genuinely haunted. "She didn't even resist," he said quietly. "Didn't kick, didn't scream, just walked with her head down. That kid's tougher than any of us." I asked him what Grayson Cole, the CEO, had said afterward. He just shook his head. Didn't say a damn word, got in his car like nothing happened, like she wasn't even real. Apparently, as they led her toward the edge of the plaza, she tripped. Her basket of flowers hit the pavement. The flowers tumbled, petals crushed, under hurried footsteps of commuters who didn't even notice. Lila just stood there, frozen. Marcus had tried to help her pick them up, but she whispered, "It's okay, mister." They were already tired anyway. He said those words stuck with him. They were already tired anyway. God. She left with nothing but the broken handle of her basket clutched in her hands. Later that afternoon, I heard something that made the whole thing even more surreal. Apparently, Grayson's own daughter, Emily, a sweet girl, no older than 12, had once stood outside schools and parks, selling homemade cupcakes to help her mother's charity. I remembered reading something like that in a company newsletter years ago. It was framed as a touching story of humble beginnings. Grayson had praised his daughter back then for being a true example of resilience and empathy. Resilience and empathy. But when a girl like Lila showed those same traits on his doorstep, he saw her as clutter. There's something tragic about that, about forgetting your own roots so completely that you punish others for standing where you once stood. I didn't see Lila again that week, but her absence began to weigh heavier. It wasn't just me anymore. One of the interns, Ravi, actually drew a little daisy on the whiteboard near the break room and wrote, "Where's our flower girl?" People noticed. The next morning, someone taped a single plastic flower to the front door handle. Silly, but it said what many of us were feeling. We missed her. And what none of us knew yet was that while we were starting to feel her absence, Lila was somewhere else, already struggling to survive without her tiny spot. The only place that gave her the illusion of being seen, of being somebody. Some place in the city, a little girl with no flowers left was walking through crowded sidewalks carrying something heavier than any basket. The weight of being forgotten. By the end of the week, Lila had become a memory people whispered about like some urban myth with petals and a ponytail. But for some of us, she wasn't just a story, she was real. And her sudden disappearance was starting to feel too heavy to ignore, especially for Jenna. Jenna worked in finance, smart, organized, no nonsense, but she had a soft side most people missed. She was one of the first to ever buy a flower from Lila. She used to keep the wilted stems in a coffee mug on her desk, right next to a family photo. When someone joked about how the flowers always drooped by lunch, Jenna just smiled and said, "It's not about how long they last, it's about how sweet the morning starts." On the fifth morning without Lila, Jenna walked into the office late. Unusual for her. She looked distracted, like her mind had wandered far from spreadsheets and stock reports. I found her later by the vending machines, holding something strange. A daisy, one of Lila's. It was half crushed, lying on the edge of the sidewalk just a few blocks from the building. Jenna had picked it up and cleaned off the dirt. Her voice cracked when she spoke. "She didn't drop this by accident," she said. "She was probably pushed that day, and no one helped her." There was a silence between us, a guilt we didn't want to name. Then she looked at me and said something that still sticks with me. "If a kid can stand outside in the cold to make pennies, the least we can do is not pretend she was never here." That's when Jenna started looking, not dramatically, not like in a movie. Just quietly asking the street vendors near the plaza if they'd seen a little girl with flowers. Most hadn't. A few shrugged. One elderly man selling roasted peanuts vaguely remembered her and said, "She used to smile too much, that's why the city spit her out." Jenna kept going. She walked further, toward the older part of downtown where there were more shelters, fewer cameras, and everything looked 2 decades behind. That's where she found her, not on the street, but near the back entrance of a rundown hospital. Lila was sitting on a broken milk crate, her basket nearly empty. The flowers she had were sadder now, wild grass, a few bent carnations, and something that looked like a weed dressed up in ribbon. But she was still selling, still smiling. That hurt more than if she'd been crying. Jenna crouched beside her. Lila didn't recognize her at first, but when she did, her face lit up, just for a moment. "Miss Jenna," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "you work in the big glass place." Jenna nodded. "We've been looking for you." Lila shrugged, as if being missed was a foreign concept. "I'm just here now. The hospital lets me stay near the back sometimes. I don't bother nobody." That's when Jenna noticed the way Lila kept glancing at the building behind her. Not fearfully, watchfully, like she was waiting for someone. "Is someone inside?" Jenna asked gently. Lila's smile dimmed. She looked down. "My mum, she's real sick. The medicine costs a lot, so I'm trying to help." Jenna couldn't respond at first. Her throat was tight. This wasn't just about a lost flower girl anymore. This was survival. And no one, not even the man who kicked her away, had stopped to ask what she was selling those flowers for. They had assumed, and in that assumption, a mother had stayed sick. A child had gone unseen. Jenna bought every flower in the basket that day, gave her $50. Lila tried to protest, tried to add a few leaves to make it worth it. But Jenna knelt down, held her hands and whispered, "You're already worth it, sweetheart." That evening, back at the office, Jenna slammed a crumpled daisy on my desk and said, "She's at Mercy General. She's sleeping outside the ER when she's not selling. Her mum's inside on borrowed time." And then she made a promise. She is not going to disappear again. The next Monday, the office felt like a powder keg, and Jenna was the spark. I saw her march into the building, eyes set like steel. She didn't stop to say good morning, didn't pause to grab her usual cup of tea. She went straight to the executive floor, past reception, past security, straight to the top. I don't know how she got past the final set of doors without being stopped. Maybe she looked too sure of herself. Maybe they knew better than to get in her way. She found Grayson Cole in his corner office, sitting in front of the skyline, skimming quarterly reports like he hadn't just destroyed a little girl's world the week before. He looked up, clearly surprised. "Can I help you, Miss Holloway?" Jenna closed the door behind her. "Do you remember the girl you had removed from the building?" she asked, voice steady, though her hands were clenched. Grayson blinked. "The one selling flowers?" "Yes. Her name is Lila. She wasn't loitering. She was surviving." Grayson leaned back in his chair, sighing. "This again? Look, I don't run a charity, Jenna. That's not what this company is." She stepped closer. "She was outside Mercy General yesterday," she said, "selling weeds dressed as flowers because her mother is in critical condition, because you kicked her away from the only place she could earn." Something in his expression shifted. Not much. Just a flicker of discomfort. But he masked it fast. "I sympathize," he replied. "But we can't allow children to crowd corporate entrances. It's a liability." Jenna stared at him like he'd just slapped her. "Do you even hear yourself?" Grayson stood now, clearly trying to reassert control. "I built this company from nothing. I worked my way up. Nobody handed me anything, Jenna, and I didn't do it by handing out pity." And then her voice cracked, not with weakness, but with disbelief. "You built it on exactly what that girl has," she said. "Grit, hunger, hope. You just had the luck to be born in a world where someone noticed." He was silent. "You know what's ironic?" she added, softer now. "Your daughter sold cupcakes for a cause once. Everyone called it admirable, inspiring. But when a poor girl sells flowers to survive, she's a threat to your image." That stopped him. Jenna didn't wait for a response. She just dropped a photo on his desk, a candid picture she'd taken the day before. Lila crouched outside the hospital, her hair soaked from light rain, tying a piece of cloth around her flowers like it was gold. She turned and left. That night, the office was empty when Grayson finally sat down again. Alone, no noise, no distractions, just silence. And somewhere in that silence, he opened his drawer and pulled out something that hadn't seen daylight in years, a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. A letter from his late wife. He didn't even have to read it to remember what it said. He'd memorized every word. But he read it anyway. "Gray, no matter how high we climb, promise me one thing. Never forget where we came from. Don't become so big that you can't see the little ones. They're the reason you're up there in the first place." He folded the letter slowly. It was supposed to be a reminder, a compass. But somewhere along the way, he'd lost it. He looked out over the glittering city and suddenly saw none of its light, only its shadows. What he didn't know, what would shatter him even more, was that his daughter had already stepped into those shadows. That very week, Emily had been sneaking food from their pantry, bottles of water, leftovers, wrapped sandwiches, not for herself, but for a girl with flowers who had lost everything. The sky had been threatening to cry all day. By mid-afternoon, the first drops fell, soft at first, like nervous tears. Then came the thunder, then the wind, then the downpour. One of those city storms that seem to wash the color off buildings and leave everything a shade darker. Most of us were already inside when it hit. The kind of storm that made even hardened New Yorkers scramble for cover. But one person wasn't inside, and she hadn't been for hours. Jenna called me just before 5. "She's still out there," she said, her voice barely holding together. "Near the hospital, selling flowers, in the rain." I didn't even need to ask who. I grabbed my coat and ran. The hospital wasn't far, but the storm made it feel like miles. Cars splashed through rivers in the street. Umbrellas turned inside out. People pushed past each other, heads low, eyes locked on shelter. And then, just across the avenue, near the broken fence that bordered an old flower stand, I saw her. Lila, soaked to the bone, hair plastered to her face, knees muddy. Her small hands held a handful of pitiful petals wrapped in newspaper that was melting in her fingers. She wasn't calling out. wasn't even trying to sell anymore. She just stood there, blinking against the storm, staring at the small flower shop across the street. A closed one with a "For Lease" sign in the window. One she'd once told Jenna she dreamed of working in. That dream now stood across the street like a cruel joke. And then she collapsed. It wasn't dramatic, no scream, no flailing, just a slow bend like a flower finally giving up under too much weight. Jenna got to her first. She had raced from work too. I saw her fall to her knees beside Lila, cradling her tiny body against her chest. "She's burning up," she whispered. "She's burning." We rushed her into the ER. Doctors moved fast when they realized how dehydrated she was. Her temperature was through the roof. She hadn't eaten properly in days. And her mother? Gone. The nurse who confirmed it said the words flatly like she was reciting weather. "She passed this morning. Kidney failure. Room 417. No visitors listed." I looked at Jenna, but she was already crying. Quietly. The kind of crying that comes when guilt feels heavier than grief. "She never told me," she said. "She never said her mum was already dying." We waited in the hallway for what felt like hours. The storm kept raging outside, and then came the second twist. The doors burst open and in came someone I never thought I'd see there. Grayson Cole. Drenched in rain, coat forgotten, tie loosened, panic in his eyes, not business panic, not boardroom nerves, real panic. Emily had called him. "She's here," his daughter had said through tears. "Dad, she fainted. She's alone. She's not okay." I watched him walk into that hospital room like a man haunted by a mirror. And when he saw her, Lila, pale and unconscious, a heart monitor beeping like the ticking of a tiny clock, he froze. He didn't say a word, but his face said everything. It wasn't just pity. It was recognition. He was looking at himself. Years ago. Poor. Abandoned. Trying to sell hope to a world that didn't care. That little girl he had ordered to be removed. She wasn't just a nuisance. She was the life he had once lived, and the innocence he'd long since traded. In that sterile hospital room, something broke in Grayson Cole. And something else quietly began to grow. The next morning, the rain had stopped. The sky was clearer, bluer, as if the storm had rinsed the city clean. But in room 6, B of Mercy General, the weight of everything that had happened still lingered like fog. Lila was awake, but barely. Her body was small against the white sheets, thinner than any 10-year-old should be. An IV dripped slowly beside her. Her face looked pale but peaceful. Her eyes fluttered open now and then, scanning the ceiling, never asking for anything. And sitting beside her was Grayson Cole, not the CEO, not the man with the corner office and the perfect tie, just a man, older, tired, hands shaking slightly as he sat with a paper bag in his lap. Inside it, a single white lily, fresh, full, flawless, the only flower Lila had ever admitted she'd never been able to sell. Too rare, too expensive. She once told Jenna she dreamed of holding one, just to know what perfect feels like. And now it was here. Grayson waited until she opened her eyes again. Then he stood, gently placed the lily on her bedside tray, and sat back down. Neither spoke for a long time. Finally, he cleared his throat. "This is for you. I thought you might want one." Lila's eyes fell on the lily, and even in her fragile state, her lips curled into a small, amazed smile. "It's real," she whispered. He nodded. "It is." Another pause. Then came the hard part. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking in a way you wouldn't expect from a man like him. "For everything. For the sidewalk. For the flowers. For not seeing you." Lila looked at him, her eyes calm. She blinked slowly. "It's okay, sir." His head jerked up. "I mean it," she said. "It's okay." "You don't have to forgive me," he replied quickly, guilt catching in his throat. What I did—" But she just smiled, soft and strange and full of something larger than either of them. Flowers don't hate anyone." He stared at her, stunned. That sentence hit him harder than any protest ever could have, because it was so pure, so undeserved, and so deeply human. He looked down, ashamed. That's when Jenna entered, holding a clipboard from the hospital social worker's office. She gave a small nod to Lila, then to Grayson. "There's something else you should see," she said, her voice quieter now. She handed Grayson a single form, a copy of a scholarship application from their company's own foundation. At the top, Lila Mae Carter, torn edges, filled out by hand in pencil. Below it, a rejection notice, a standard form letter that thanked her for applying, then informed her that the scholarship required certain socioeconomic verification criteria she couldn't meet, criteria Grayson himself had designed years ago to weed out unserious applicants. He looked at the date. It had been rejected 2 weeks before he had her removed from the building. His hands trembled. Jenna spoke again. She applied using a borrowed tablet at a public library. Used the building address as her dream office. She thought maybe if she sold enough flowers there, someone would notice her. Grayson swallowed hard. The very system he built had failed the very kind of child it claimed to help, and he'd kicked her out like trash. That night, Grayson didn't sleep. He sat beside Lila for hours, watching her breathe, watching the lily bloom slowly in its glass of water. And somewhere, in that quiet room, something inside him shifted, not just guilt. Something older, something deeper, a seed of change. It's strange how some places hold ghosts, not the scary kind, but the soft ones. The kind that whisper in your ear when you pass by, the kind that remind you what used to be there. For months after Lila was hospitalized, the space outside the corporate building, the one where she used to sit, felt haunted. The same crowds walked by, the same doors spun open and shut. But something was missing, and everyone felt it, even if they couldn't name it. Until one bright morning in spring, something new appeared. Not a child, not a basket of picked flowers, but a small wooden structure painted pale yellow with green vines curling around the edges. A flower stall, neat, cheerful, and impossible to miss. A handmade sign hung above it, Lila's Garden, fresh daisies, wildflowers, peonies, marigolds, and yes, even white lilies. Arranged not by wealth, but by joy. Each bundle came with a handwritten tag. "May this bloom brighten your day." From someone who once believed in pavement dreams. That morning, the employees didn't rush. They paused, they smiled. And when Lila stepped out from behind the counter, now healthy, hair neatly braided, wearing a clean white dress with flower buttons, some of them actually clapped. She gave out hugs like petals. When one woman asked what had changed, Lila simply said, "I used to sell dreams in petals. Now I'm growing them." Behind her stood a man who no longer wore suits to prove his worth, Grayson Cole, older, softer, no longer CEO, just a father figure to a girl who had taught him how to feel again. He had stepped down 3 months earlier. His final boardroom meeting ended with a simple statement. "I forgot where I came from. A little girl reminded me I'd like to spend the rest of my life making sure no child like her goes unseen again." That same day, he launched the May and Marigold Foundation, named after Lila's mother and his late wife. The mission? Provide education, shelter, and mentorship to children living on the streets or just on the edge of being forgotten. And Lila? She went to school. She aced every class. She became a speaker at city youth forums. Not because she wanted to be famous, but because when a teacher once asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up, she said, "I want to be the grown-up I needed when I was 10. Sometimes I pass by the building on my way to meetings, and every time I see Lila's Garden. I buy a flower, not because I need it, but because that little stall is a reminder that even the smallest seeds planted in the cracks of a cold city can bloom into something that changes everything.